Holding chapter 4 in the Maimer Va'ata Tetzaveh. There's a question on the table here, but we'll just review, but we won't get back into all the details, the 4 questions that the Rebbe asks on the opening, the title verse of this Maimer, because we want to try and avoid getting overly technical and confusing. Let's just talk about the question on the table now. We're at chapter 4 of Va'ata Tetzaveh. Mendy, you're posting a link to the Hebrew text. You can also find it in English in Nurturing Faith from the Chassidic Heritage series from Kahat Publication Society. Okay, so we said that Moshe Rabbeinu, the Rebbe quotes from the Maimer of the previous Rebbe, the Kibbutz Yehudim from 1927, and he says that in his Maimer, the Frierdiker Rebbe says that Moshe is called a Rai Mehemna. The Kabbalah calls Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, a Rai Mehemna, which simply means a faithful shepherd, that God entrusts him, he's trustworthy, trusts him to take care of his people. But a deeper meaning of Rai Mehemna is that he's a shepherd of faith, meaning that he shepherds faith, he nurtures the people with faith, he feeds them faith. What does that mean? That faith naturally would be something that doesn't inform the person, it's not something that affects a person on a conscious level, it's something that remains abstract and doesn't impact them in their daily lives. It's just something that's sort of outside, transcendent. And Moshe Rabbeinu's function is to cause the people, to feed them the faith, meaning for them to internalize the faith, so that it becomes something that impacts them in their daily lives. The analogy we gave in last class was of a thief that prays to God that he should be successful in his break-in and his stealing. So he has faith, but that faith doesn't impact his behavior. So he believes in God, believes God could help him, believes God will intervene and will help him. That's why he prays to God. But the fact that God says not to steal, that doesn't bother him in any way. He will still go ahead and do whatever it is that he wants to do. So Moshe Rabbeinu, his function is to take that faith that is already there and cause it to be impactful on the person, that it impacts the person and impacts his behavior. That's what we said. Then the Frierdiker Rebbe says that this is also the role of all the Moshes of every generation. Every generation has a Moses, and the leaders of the Jewish people in every generation, their job is also to nurture the faith of the people, meaning that their faith should be internalized and should become something that affects their conscious selves and their behavior. And then he gives an example of Mordechai. Mordechai, one of the heroes of the story of Purim, the Medrash refers to him as the Moshe, the Moses of his generation. And he impacted the people, he nurtured the faith of the people and caused them to remain strong and to reach a level of self-sacrifice. So that was this idea of being able to have self-sacrifice is an expression of the faith of the people, as we'll see a little bit later, a little bit deeper, is an expression of the faith being something that impacts their behavior to the extent that they're willing to sacrifice, to make sacrifices for it. So that's what he says about Mordechai. Then the Frierdiker Rebbe goes on to say that when a person is crushed in exile, he could reach the luminary, the source of light, meaning that the faith that comes from the faith that is the source of his is sort of an expression of the essence of the soul, and so through self-sacrifice, which comes as a result of being crushed, one reaches that source, the source of light. So this answers one of the questions that we asked in the Maimer about why it says that the oil was crushed to be a luminary when it should be crushed for illumination, and the answer is because through being crushed, one reaches the source of light. Okay. That's what we said. Then the Rebbe asks, at the end of chapter 3, what is the connection? He's asking on the sequence, the structure of the previous Rebbe's Maimer, where he starts by talking about the fact that Moshe nurtures the faith of the people. Then he says that is true also of the Moshe of every generation. And from there he jumps to, once he gets into Mordechai, nurturing the faith of his people, he goes into the self-sacrifice. That the idea of self-sacrifice, one reaches the source, the essence of the soul, through and self-sacrifice through cusses, through being crushed, through the persecution and challenges that they face that cause them to have self-sacrifice. That's how they reach the source of light. So the Rebbe asks, what's the connection of these ideas? How do these ideas flow into each other? They seem to be two separate things. There's the idea that Mordechai, that Moshe nurture the faith of the people to internalize their faith. And then there's another thing, which is that in times of challenges, of difficulty, when somebody rises to the occasion and has self-sacrifice, they reach the source, they reach the essence. What is the connection between these ideas? So chapter 4, we're going to attempt to answer that question. So Perek Dalet, chapter 4. V'hinei, habir b'posek v'atet Tetzaveh bo b'hamaymer b'hemshech la'mavur b'tchilas hamaymer. This explanation in the verse v'atet Tetzaveh, in the previous Rebbe's discourse, comes in continuation to his opening verse that he analyzes, which is from the Megillah, from the book of Esther, that the people accepted upon themselves that which they had already begun. And that is, that the people began, that the people accepted upon themselves what they started at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, the people just began this process, but in the time of Haman, in the time of the decree of Haman, in the story of Purim, which is about 1,000 years, give or take, after Mount Sinai, that's when they finally accepted upon themselves the Torah. We'll get to that for a moment. Let's look at the brackets. Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim kimu ma shekiblu kvar. So the Gemara says, there's a verse in the book of Esther, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. The people fulfilled and accepted, the Yehudim, the Jews fulfilled and accepted upon themselves. So the Gemara asks, what's the order is a little weird. It should be the kiblu. They accept. In the verse in Esther is saying simply that they accepted. That Esther and Mordechai, after the whole miracle, established the holiday of Purim, and the people accepted upon themselves this to observe this holiday and everything that goes along with it, the different things that we have to do on the holiday. But the Gemara notes that it says they did and they accepted. You first should accept and then do. So the Gemara says what it means is the Megillah is alluding to something else, which is they did what they had what they had previously accepted. Kimu masha kiblu. They established, they accepted what they had already started at Mount Sinai. Similar to this interpretation, in Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe brings that the kibul haYehudim es asher yechelu lasos. It means the same thing. The Kibbul HaYehudim, the people accepted as Asher Yechel Las is what they already started doing. What did they start doing? At Mount Sinai, they started to observe the Torah and mitzvahs. And at the story of Purim, that's when they accepted it. Okay? So that's what it says. Now, this is a strange thing. What does it mean that at the time of Mount Sinai, the people were on such a high level, they were also righteous, they had this great revelation of godliness, and yet they only began it. They only started, and at Mount Sinai, and at the story of Purim, they accepted it finally. The story of Purim, they were in exile, they were between temples, the temple had been destroyed. What's going on here? In the Gemara, it talks about the fact that it discusses this on the concept of Kaf Aleim Har Kegigis. The pasuk says, "Vayisatzu v'tachtis ahar," that the people were at the foot of the mountain. What is it? But the term "tachtis ahar," at the foot of the mountain, seems a little strange. So the Gemara says, they stood under the mountain. Hashem picked the mountain up over their head, and he forced them, as it were. He said, either you accept it, or this is going to be the end. To discuss that, let's leave that whole conversation. We just came from the holiday of Shavuos. We explored that a lot during Shavuos. Let's leave that on the side. But from there, the Gemara says that was then. So at Mount Sinai, it was sort of compelled. At Purim, that's when they accepted it, sort of their own volition. How does this fit that they were forced into it at Mount Sinai when they said Nasa v'nishma? Another question. Let's avoid that now. The point here we're making is that at Purim they accepted. So let's see what is it. So the Rebbe says like this. So the Frierdiker Rebbe notes in his discourse. This seems to be a wondrous thing, a pella, a strange thing. The term pella, he brings in note 24. Abir b'dik lashon zeh. The Rebbe talks about this idea that Pella represents a certain level of certainly beyond comprehension. So this idea is a puzzling thing. At Mount Sinai, the people were on the highest of levels. They had the greatest of revelation. They experienced the greatest of divine revelations. Aside for the fact that before Mount Sinai, there were great divine revelations that they experienced. That just the whole experience of the exodus of Egypt was a great miraculous event. Or Befrat B'Kriyas Yamsuf, certainly at the splitting of the sea, where it says that even the maidservant experienced the revelation at that time that Yecheskel ben Buzi hadn't experienced at the height of his prophecy. Mount Sinai, the revelation was even greater than all of those. So at Mount Sinai, that's when the people were sort of on the highest spiritual level. During the time of Achashverosh, they were on the lowest of levels. Aside for the fact that they were in exile, and every exile means that there's no divine revelation, that's part of the meaning, part of the definition of exile is that there's no divine revelation at that time. You can't experience divinity. The Kol Golos, who bedugmas Golos Mitzrayim, every exile is like Egypt. And just as in Egypt, so every exile is analogous to Egypt. And just as in Egypt it says the people couldn't hear Moshe. Moshe comes and is sharing with the people what he hears from God. And the people couldn't listen. So even when Moshe is coming to talk to them, the exile experience was such that they weren't even open to hearing what he had to say. So too in every exile there are challenges to observance of Torah mitzvahs where we're not as sensitive and as open to divine revelation. So that's in general in exile. But however, at the time of the Purim story, they were in even a deeper exile. There was an even greater concealment. Why? Because there were decrees against them. It wasn't just that there was no divine revelation. It wasn't just that there was no temple. But the people were facing annihilation. That represents an even darker, even greater concealment of godliness. When, as we discussed earlier in some other contexts, but the idea that there's a challenge to God, when there's a challenge to Torah observance, that constitutes a concealment of godliness. So when everything is indifferent, when the world is indifferent, that's a certain level of concealment. But when it actually goes against it, when we're challenging God, when you're being told that you can't serve God, that constitutes an even greater concealment. Nevertheless, if we contrast this, that at Mount Sinai they're in the highest spiritual level. In the time of Purim they're in the lowest spiritual level. And yet, in the time of Mount Sinai, they were just at the beginning. They were just starting the process. And it's only in the time of the decree of Haman that the people actually accepted what they had started at Mount Sinai. So they ratified, they fully accepted what was started at Mount Sinai when they were at their lowest spiritual level. So this is a puzzling thing, or a pella, as he says here, a wondrous thing. So the Friedrich Rebbe explains that in the time of Haman, what was special about that time? How is it that at that time they were able to accept what they merely started at Mount Sinai? Was because in the time of Haman they had Mesiras Nefesh, they had self-sacrifice. Aside from the fact that they had self-sacrifice, not to go against, not to challenge, not to deny God, or to renounce their faith. The Rebbe in Torah says like this, that we know in the Megillah the Jews are called Yehudim. That's how they're referred. We're referred to by many names, Bnei Yisrael. The idea that we're called Yehudim, why are we called Yehudim? So the Gemara says that anybody who, the word Yehuda, the name Yehuda represents submission and acknowledgement. So the Gemara says that whoever acknowledges God and submits to God, and Yehuda is Moida, acknowledges his subservience to God, is called a Yehudi. So where is the greatest expression of this acknowledgement, of this devotion to God? When you have self-sacrifice. So when you have when you're being challenged to renounce your religion, God forbid, and you withstand that, and you, on the contrary, not only do you not renounce it, but you actually affirm it, so then you're called a Yehudi. All the Jews in the book of Esther are called Yehudim, meaning that all of them had this experience where they all affirmed their devotion, their connection to God. So Alter Rebbe Tanya explains that in the story of Purim, Haman's decree was only against Yehudim, meaning only against people who refused to renounce their religion, their faith in God. So if you were to renounce, just convert out of the faith, then this decree, the edict of extinction against the Jews, wouldn't apply to you. Wouldn't be applicable. So everybody could have theoretically spared their lives by renouncing their faith in God. And yet, not a single one did. Not only didn't they, but the Alter Rebbe tapped into a higher frequency, a higher realm, says that none of them even entertained the thought. They didn't even entertain the thought. It wasn't even a thought that would cross their mind to renounce their faith. So we see that the people had self-sacrifice not to renounce God. That's why they're called Yehudim. But besides that, in addition to not renouncing their faith, they also actually had self-sacrifice to actually go ahead and fulfill the mitzvahs anyway. They also defied this decree by going out. Not that there was a decree against public gatherings and study, but if you could have skirted the decree by renouncing your faith, so maybe you retained faith inside, but you didn't have to go around outside flaunting your devotion to God. And yet that's precisely what they did. They went out in public and studied Torah publicly. Vizahu. So.
When did they go publicize?
What?
When did they publicize Hashem? They didn't publicize Hashem.
It says they would go around. Yeah, sure, they went around. Mordechai went and gathered the people. Right, Mordechai is the one who did it. We're going to see. So there's the famous. There's an obvious question that would arise. The famous Levush, where the Levush says that the difference between Chanukah and Purim is that Chanukah was a spiritual decree. Chanukah was a decree against. It was a war on faith, a war on Judaism. Purim wasn't a spiritual one; it was a physical one. That explains a lot of the differences between the observances of the two holidays. Purim was annihilation, was genocide. That was what they were facing. It wasn't a spiritual, it wasn't a religious war. Here we're saying that the people could have skirted that. So it's not a contradiction because Haman wasn't looking to eradicate Judaism. He was looking to kill Jews. He said, if you no longer belong to the Jewish people, so you no longer belong to them. So it's not really a contradiction. They could have avoided it by renouncing their faith, and then thus removing themselves from the equation of the Jews being annihilated. But that's that. But so it's not a contradiction. But let's keep going. As you said, who was the inspiration for them to remain steadfast, to remain strong, to serve and not to renounce God? That was Moshe of his generation, meaning Mordechai. This is then the meaning of that the people accepted upon themselves what they had begun. That in the time of Matan Torah, Mount Sinai was only the beginning, and in the time of Purim, that's when they ratified it. That's when they accepted it upon themselves. Through the fact that they actually had to have self-sacrifice in the time of Purim, nis'alu be'inyin zeh, so they were able to rise in this regard. How is it possible? The question is, how is it possible that in the time when the people were on the lowest spiritual level, they were able to reach a level higher than the people at the time of Mount Sinai who were at the highest spiritual level? Is because at the time of Mount Sinai there was no requirement, there was no need for self-sacrifice. In the time of Purim, there was a need for self-sacrifice, and this self-sacrifice elevated them to such a level where they were able to accept, to devote themselves more deeply to Torah than even that original generation of Mount Sinai. Okay. Let's take a look this is an attempt to answer the question we asked about the connection between the idea that Moshe and the Moshe of every generation strengthens the faith of the people, nurtures their faith, and the union of Kosas Lamar, that through being crushed and self-sacrifice, they reach the essence. We're trying to explain that. So we'll get to that in the second paragraph here of chapter 4, but before...
I don't know what the pella is. That's the way of life.
What's the way of life?
When people are broken, they go to find...
The pella that he was asking, the pella was, how is it that specifically then they were able to do something that they couldn't when they were on a higher spiritual level? If you would think that if you're going to accept upon yourself the Torah really deeply, it should be when you're at your when you're most inspired, when you're most holy feeling, when you're most spiritual. In the time of Purim, they weren't very spiritual, right? So yeah, the answer is through Mesiras Nefesh. That's how you get there. That would be a natural. That's the answer. But okay, so before we get to the how this is an attempt to answer the question, let's just follow up with the footnotes. 22. Mehem shecha nyonim ba maimor b'tereish ba'ara haba mashma dezesh kiblu b'mei achashverosh ubizman ha'gzeira pirshashi b'mei achashverosh ba'avas hanes shenas alehem v'leish leim d'shnei nyonim b'zarei l'kamen siftes. There just notes that in Torah the Kibbutz Yehudim that they accepted upon themselves. So in Chassidus it seems to suggest that they accepted upon themselves in the time of the decree, in that year build up to the decree, from when there was decreed, when the extermination was decreed, till the date that it arrived. It was during that time that they had the self-sacrifice, that they accepted. But from Rashi and from the simple meaning, certainly the way the Gemara addresses this thing, when we talk about Kimu v'Kiblu, that happened afterwards. So that they accepted upon themselves after, and Rashi says from the great miracle that happened, that's when they accepted upon themselves. So Rebbe says you could say that they're actually that they accepted it in two stages. There's the acceptance that happened during the decree, as discussed in Chassidus, then there's the acceptance that happened after the decree, as is the simple understanding, and Rashi's commentary, which we'll see later in chapter 9, how that all works out. 23. Okay, so he says that that this idea of V'kibul Yehudim we're saying is similar to the meaning of Kimu V'kiblu, the Gemara versus the Maimer, but they could be two different things that's explained elsewhere. Okay, we already noted note 24. We read 24. Let's see note 28, where he says that they didn't entertain a thought of renouncing their faith. Then he says not only did they not entertain a thought of renouncing their faith, but even more so, they actually had self-sacrifice to fulfill Torah mitzvahs, which in 28 he says Shezo Chidush Gadol Yeser, which is even more impressive. Because with regard to faith, even somebody who's not observant can express their faith, will not renounce their faith. But to actually be proactive, to go out and actually fulfill the mitzvahs, that's already an even more impressive level. And then he says not only that, but they even went and gathered publicly, had public demonstrations of mitzvah observance. And note 29, which is obviously even greater, even more impressive as is obvious. Okay. Back inside the second paragraph of chapter 4. So now we can say that the explanation of kasis lamor, that you're crushed for the luminary, that meaning that through kasis, through being crushed, through broken and shattered, you reach the source, the luminary who beir al zeh shebizman hagzeira dafke bo lemesiris nefesh beifnei l'biyah. So this seems to be an explanation, as explained, as to how they're able to reach such a high level. And as you just pointed out, self-sacrifice comes from the essence of the soul, which is higher than revelation. The essence is not something that's revealable. Essence is. So it's it's the luminary from which the light, which is revelation, comes. Through them being crushed. That reveals, that exposes the essence of the soul, ma'ir, the essence of light. So that's the explanation. That the idea that through Mesiris Nefesh they can reach the source of light is explained. Through Mordechai, nurturing their faith, that causing them to have Mesiris Nefesh, bringing them to a state of Mesiris Nefesh, through that state of Mesiris Nefesh, they reach the essence. You reveal the essence. But from the sequence in the discourse, in the previous Rebbe's Maimer, it seems that where the explanation of Kasis Lamar, being crushed for the luminary, meaning that the self-sacrifice leading to the source of light, comes after explaining the idea of Raya Mehemna, the role of the Moshe of every generation, to nurture the faith. This seems to come as a result of Moshe causing them to internalize their faith. So what we said just now in chapter 4 is that through self-sacrifice we reach the essence of light. Who causes them to get to self-sacrifice? Mordechai. But still, it seems to be two separate things. There's the fact that Moshe and Mordechai, subsequently Mordechai, and every Moshe of every generation nurtures the faith, that the faith should be internalized. That's one thing. Then there's another thing, that Mordechai caused them to have Mesiris Nefesh, self-sacrifice. Right? The fact that Mordechai causes them to have self-sacrifice would explain that from that self-sacrifice, that causes the time that demands self-sacrifice, they can reach the essence of the light. But in the Maimer, he's saying it as following, explaining that Moshe causes them to internalize, that he's called a Rai Mehemna, a shepherd of faith. Meaning that it's the fact that he shepherds the faith, meaning that the faith should be internalized in the people, that's what then leads to the Kasis Lamo'er. You follow? Not that he just simply that he, or even the fact that he leads them to self-sacrifice, is that the same thing or not? That's what we have to understand. What we said now doesn't seem to explain that. So the question remains. The question we started chapter 4 with remains. We need to understand what that means. So chapter 5, we're going to start that explanation. But okay. So should we start it or no? Huh? We have 2 minutes. Okay, so let's start. Chapter 5. So we can explain it based on what's known. We know that the Jewish people are referred to as Maminim, B'nai Maminim, were believers, children of believers. That a Jew naturally, his natural state is to believe in God. That is part of their DNA. Why is it that a Jew naturally believes in God, doesn't need any proof of God's existence? He naturally already believes in God. Why is that? There are 2 reasons. One is Lefi Shemazlayu Chazi, because his mazel sees. What does it mean that his mazel sees? Mazel, like you say, mazel tov is good fortune, or good luck, but that's not what we mean when we say mazel. Mazel also, there's the Gemara in several places says, Ein mazel Yisrael. People don't have mazel. What is that? That's mazel. Is like when people are into the horoscopes, the constellations and the stars. If you're born during a certain month and there's a certain constellation, that causes that leads to a certain destiny or a certain. The Gemara establishes that that's not the case. Ein mazel Yisrael. There is no such mazel for the Jewish people. So what do we mean by mazel? That your mazel sees. So he says like this: that neshama shalamayla. The mazel is the neshama that's above. Every neshama, every person has a soul. Only a small part of our soul ends up within our body. Majority of our soul, the higher level of our soul, remains not in that. Not that it's distant, it's disconnected, it's millions of miles away. It's here too, but it's not enclosed in the body. It remains outside of the body. It's transcendent, and that's called mazel. The soul above, the part of the soul that's above, that's not in the body, sees godliness. Seeing which is higher than understanding. And this causes that the part of the soul that's in the body, the conscious self, should believe in God. So the soul, as it's above, not within the person, that part of the soul sees God, sees Him beyond intellect. You could see something, the expression, seeing is believing. It's not understanding. You can see something and not understand it, but you see it nonetheless, and it impacts you nonetheless. So you see it on a level that's beyond consciousness, beyond even intellect, beyond understanding. That experience of the soul is then mazel. What's the term mazel mean? Mazel is like from the word noisel, like it drips. So that experience, that part of the soul, seeing God, seeing godliness, drips, sends sort of these little messages down to the soul in the body that then now believes in God. Why does it believe? Because the part of the soul above, in the supraconscious part of the soul, sees God. This idea, the mazel sees, so there's the Gemara, the Gemara says about Daniel, that the prophet Daniel, that the verse where he says that I saw this sight, and I beheld the sight. The people that were with me didn't see it, but they were overcome with a great fear. So the Gemara asks, what does that mean that they were overcome with a great fear? They didn't see, so what were they afraid of? So the Gemara says, even though they didn't see it, but their mazel saw it. So as this explains here, we're explaining here, what does it mean that their mazel saw? That their neshama, as it is above, saw. And because the neshama saw, that caused them to be afraid. So they didn't know why they were afraid. They hadn't seen anything. But that's also the idea that the person could sometimes have an inspiration. Why you wake up one morning and out of the blue you're inspired to be better, to serve God. Where does it come? To do tshuva. Where does it come from? Like the Baal Shem Tov talks about the baskol. The Gemara, the Mishnah says that every day there are baskols, there are heavenly voices that go out and call out to us. We don't hear them. So what's the point of them? Because the point is that even though we don't hear them, but our neshama, the lemaila, the mazel, does hear it. And that sends sort of these subliminal, subconscious messages to ourselves that then affect us in that way. So that's the first explanation. Why are people believers in God? Because mazlayu chazi, our mazel, the neshama as it is above, sees God. The second reason we'll get to the next class, Mr. Shem.
Oh, yeah.